Today we're looking at the sodium-ion cell used in NexPower's prototype V3 hardware. I only have a picture of it here because my cells are presently still under test. We'll talk about that more later. Specifically, we're going to see how well it performs when subjected to large charge and discharge currents. The V3 cell in my prototype unit is a 10 amp hour cylindrical 32140 cell that I am almost certain is an off-the-shelf part. More on that later. In a previous video, I discussed my test results while charging this battery at 5 amps, which is C/2. Since it's a 10 amp hour cell, that's this guy if you remember him. Since NexPower's products retain the Prius's original computers, we can only use a small portion of the actual cell energy. We talked about that before here. Namely, the Prius disables assist when the pack drops below 210 volts. And then it disables regen when the pack exceeds 250 volts. Therefore, when used in the Prius, I concluded that the V3 sodium cell's best case C/2 usable energy was 837 watt hours, which is only 36% of the total energy that's within the cell. That was this area under the curve again. It's important to note that this 837 watt hour usable energy is only possible at very low discharge current. In other words, this 837 watt hour figure is only valid when that current is 5 amps, which is around 1200 watts of assist or regen in the Prius, which can do, 25 kilowatts. So a very small amount. So my understanding is that the Prius can briefly assist at up to 140 amps and routinely hits 110 amps while accelerating. On the regen side, my understanding is that the Prius can regen to at least 100 amps and routinely hits 90 amps while braking. Therefore, today we're going to look at test results at these higher currents. This chart here is only valid at 5 amps of charge or discharge, and so we need to come up with data at the current values that we're using in the Prius. Several years ago, I developed a long-term accelerated cell tester which is designed to push cells to their limits. This test is extremely abusive and doesn't represent typical real-world driving conditions. I designed this tester to quickly weed out cells that aren't up for the task of being in a high-current traction battery. Therefore, the data this test produces is primarily useful to compare relative differences between various cells. For example, if one cell survives 1,000 cells and another cell survives 4,000 cells, then you can draw conclusions that the 4,000 cycle cell is better suited for high current charge-discharge applications. I developed this tester to qualify cells for the G1 Honda Insight. As such, this test charges cells specifically for that application. Cells under test are charged at 70 amps and then discharged at 110 amps. Technically, the discharger is actually a 32.4 milliohm load. That's a calibrated load, which means we discharge at 110 amps at the beginning of each discharge cycle, and we drop down to about 92 amps once we've hit the cell being fully discharged. And that's, again, because we have a constant resistance, not a constant current. The charger is constant current regardless of cell voltage. So while we are charging it, it's always going to be the value we choose, in this case 70 amps. Fortunately, the Gen 3 Toyota Prius nominally operates with similar parameters as the G3 Insight, which is important, again, because the test results are only relative to other cells and they don't reflect real-world operation. We'll talk about why. Hence, these comparisons are only valued if we test each cell at the same current values across the same pack voltage range. If the Prius operated at vastly different current values, I'd be unable to compare the V3 sodium cell's test results with all of my existing data. Fortunately, the Gen 3 Prius and the G1 Insight have similar operating regions. So what results does this test produce? Let's first look at an example. So this is a 5 amp hour cell from the G3 Honda Insight. And this specific cell was tested for 5,281 cycles. And at 5,281 cycles, it retained 90% of its original capacity. At 4,000 cycles, so at cycle 4,000, it was still at 93%, which is very good. In the automotive industry, cells are typically considered good as long as they retain 80% or more of their original design capacity. Therefore, even under severely abusive test conditions from my tester, this cell was still considered good by a long shot after 5,281 cycles, which is very impressive. Since this is a 5 amp hour nominal cell, the 70 amp charge current was 14 C, and the 110 amp discharge current was 22 C. Pretty impressive. The only reason I stopped testing this cell at 5,281 cycles was that I ran out of time to test it. I don't typically test cells longer than 3 months. If every cell I tested survived this test, I would only be able to test 4 different cells per year per test head. I have 2 test heads, so I could test 8 cells per year if everyone lived through it. Of course, I will also stop any test if a failure occurs before that time limit. For example, I will stop a test if a cell visibly deforms or emits smoke, or if the remaining capacity drops below 80% of the initial value. Again, that's because that's the generally recommended industry accepted value, is when you drop below 80%, your pack is considered failed. I also will stop the test if the cell exceeds the manufacturer's stated maximum safe operating temperature. And if that temperature is unknown, I typically stop testing lithium cells, hypothetically, if they exceed 60 degrees C. Note that I perform this test outside in a fireproof, explosion-proof environment, so don't do this inside. You don't want cells failing. I've tested numerous cells with these parameters, almost exclusively from hybrid and electric vehicles sold in America. So Tesla, Ford, Honda, Toyota, etc. Lots of cells that I've tested. Most cells survive this test for the entire 3-month test period. Some cells do eventually fail because some cells eventually do fail the test because the remaining capacity drops below 80%. This includes NexPower's V1 LFP cell, whose capacity had dropped to 76.8 after just 1,200 cycles. As I mentioned in a previous video, at that time, this was the worst performing cell I had ever tested. So, how poorly did the prototype V3 NexPower cylindrical cell do? In a word, poorly. This cell's outer wall case temperature increased from 25 degrees C to 51 degrees C after just 3 cycles. That's typically what a good lithium cell will stay at through the duration of the test, 4 months. It will stay around 51 degrees. This is 3 cycles we were there. The temperature then increased to 65 degrees C during cycle 12 and to 71 degrees C during cycle 34. Since the manufacturer's maximum operated temperature is 70 degrees C, the prototype V3 NexPower sodium failed my test criteria after just 34 cycles. I've never actually had a cell fail due to overheating. Most cells don't even come close to their upper temp limit. In this particular test, I gave NexPower every benefit of the doubt too. The cell was removed from the enclosure that it comes in and turned such that the cell under test was facing up, which was required because I was unable to connect high current test leads to the cell while the cells were installed in the 3D printed plastic enclosure. From a temperature perspective, this test setup benefited the V3 test results because it provided more airflow than would be possible while installed in the enclosure. In every other test I've ever performed, the cells remained inside their OEM enclosures, so that, whatever pack they were in. This gives the V3 NexPower cell an additional advantage because it was able to radiate heat in all directions. Note also that I'm testing just one cell. In real-world conditions, there would be 70 times more heat generated in this same pack, and therefore the cells would be unable to radiate heat as freely as was possible in my test conditions. Again, I'm giving NexPower the benefit of the doubt there. Also, I can't charge and discharge 70 times more power because that would be a ton of power. 26, 21 kilowatts. I'm doing much less than that in my test condition. So while performing this test, the NexPower cell got so hot that the glue separating the bottom and middle cells melted and fell off the cell under test. I was literally able to pick the glue blob up, push it against the overheating cell, and watch in real time as it melted. I'll show you a video of that. In this video, it's just going to be on my laptop screen, but I will post that B-reel so that you can watch it here. The glue on this is like coming off because it's so hot. you can literally just see the glue has actually melted. This glue is liquid right now because it's above its melting point. You can actually see that the glue,
look at it sticking to this cell wall,
will melt if I touch the cell. So I mean, this is, you can see it's just melting. So this is the glue that is holding this pack together during assembly.
So and again, that B-reel will be posted. Side note here, I do know how to edit videos, but I'm just not taking the time here. You know, I'm just trying to get the information out there. Okay, and so when I say glue, I do mean glue. This is actually a different adhesive than the one Jack and I discussed previously, that Jack suggests repeatedly is used in his product somehow as a thermal paste. No, this glue goes by a different name. It's hot glue from a hot glue gun. That's what's supporting the upper and middle cells, which are resting on the lower cells via a layer of hot glue, whose melting point is certainly below 70 degrees C, based on my observations. I am grabbing a sheet of paper out of frame. So this paper here, whoops, there is a layer of hot glue between the cells here, and I believe also here as well, that I hadn't observed previously because I hadn't flipped this pack upside down. So yeah, hot glue. So the AEC Q100 standard dictates that grade 1 components must operate from -40 degrees C to 125 degrees C. Hot glue fails to meet this goal by at least 55 degrees C. Hopefully this glue is remedied on production units. Fortunately, Jack has retained the OEM temperature sensors, which should dial back assist and regen power before these cells ever reach 70 degrees C due to internal self-heating. I have not verified this claim, but since it's in Jack's favor, I'll leave that test procedure to him. So coming back to how well this cell performed on my accelerated long-term tester, unfortunately I'm unable to draw the intended results as the cell failed to test after only 34 cycles due to overheating, as mentioned previously. We can certainly extract results from the brief data we gathered, but we can't compare these results to other cell results. For example, it isn't a fair comparison to say that cell X lasted 5,281 cycles, whereas the V3 cell only lasted 34 cycles. That is an unfair conclusion, as there isn't enough test data to compare the V3 cell's long-term capacity to other cells, because the test stopped due to a safety parameter violation rather than a cell capacity violation. Put another way, it's fair to compare the V1 NexPower cell, which failed after 1,200 cycles, due to dropping below the 80% cutoff, you can compare that cell to the 5 amp hour G3 Honda Insight cell, which retained 90% of the capacity after 5,281 cycles. So after more than 4 times the cycles, we retained more than twice the capacity, so 8 times better, I guess, 10, probably 9. This is a fair comparison because the V1 cell failed due to the primary test parameter, which was cell capacity, which dropped below 80%. So in short, we can't draw accelerated lifetime results from the V3 cell that I just tested. However, we can still extract useful data from this test, so let's look at it. First, let's look at how much energy we were able to cram into this cell while charging at a fixed 70 amp regen. In cycle 1, the first cycle when the cell was cool, the 10 amp hour prototype, this cell, the 10 amp hour prototype NexPower V3 sodium cell stored a whopping 1.01 amp hours. What does this mean? Under heavy regen, this cell is only able to accept 10.1% of its nominal 10 amp hour charge when used in the Prius. In comparison, NexPower's V1 LFP cell achieved 4.6 amp hours, which is 92% of its nominal 5 amp hour charge. So the LFP got 92% of the maximum value it could, and this cell got 10% of the maximum value that it could.
In short, NexPower's V1 LFP cell initially performed 4.6 times better than their V3 cell under the same extreme test conditions. So that's cycle 1. Now in cycle 2, because we were charging this and discharging it very quickly, the cell had actually heated up, and the amount of energy we were able to stick in jumped up from 1 to 1.2 amp hours. And the reason this is probably because of the sodium cells being able to intercalcate into the the anode or the cathode, depending on whether we're regenerating or charging or discharging. So in cycle 3, we increased again to 1.3 amp hours, and then by cycle 10, when that cell was really warm, we'd actually increased to 1.7 amp hours. So there is certainly a strong correlation between cell temperature and how much energy we can put in before the pack voltage would hit the maximum in the Prius, so the 250 volts, for example, in the Prius. And so a pack that is cool is going to be able to store a lot less energy, like 1 amp hour if you hit it with 70 amps of regen, whereas a pack that's very warm is going to be closer to like the 1.7 amp hours. Now, probably you aren't going to get up to that 1.7 amp hours because I would imagine the Prius's battery monitor will probably reduce regen quite a bit if the cell is getting up to 65 degrees Celsius or 70 degrees Celsius. I think, yeah, at cycle 12 we were at 65 degrees, I believe. And so we're probably going to have dialed that regen power quite a bit back. So I would think that probably there's about maybe 1.5 amp hours that you could regen at 70 amps. So note that even though the V3 sodium cell failed the test due to overheating after only a few dozen cycles, I did continue running the test for several hundred more cycles. During this post-test period, the cell temperature stayed below 73 degrees C each time I measured it, and the capacity remained remarkably flat. So in cycle 100, the cell was 1.75 amp hours, in 200 it was 1.7, in 300 it was 1.77, in 400 it was 1.79 amp hours or so. Some of this variance here is due to the fact that I test this outside. The temperature outside does rise and fall. In my long-term test data, you can actually count the days by the number of humps in the graph there. So worth noting there is a little bit of test uncertainty. This is not a IEC or any kind of UL like fully qualified test. It's not running in a temperature chamber. But again, it gives me the data that I originally designed it for, and it is a very valid test still. And again, you could actually go back if you need to and look at the temperature in an almanac on any day, and you can reverse that. But ultimately, on a good cell, it doesn't really change the capacity that much. Here the temperature changes it by, it increases by like 70%. So the sodium cell has a 70% energy storage increase when it increases from room temperature to 70 degrees C, which is quite large for a cell. I suspect that all sodium cells are like that. From this data, we can conclude that in the Prius's voltage range, the V3 sodium cell can only store a fraction of its nominal energy. Again, once the cell was hot, I found the maximum of the nominal was 17.9%. So we can only put 18% of the nominal value of energy that this thing can hold in the Prius. Again, due to that limited voltage range. So this voltage range is quite limited. And then, of course, we have this cell just doesn't handle the charge well. We'll talk about that more later. So while the V3 sodium cell storage range is small, it is fairly linear, particularly when compared to NexPower's V1 LFP cell. We talked about that before too. So the sodium is very linear, whereas LFP is typically very flat in this range. That's why the LFP does so much better, or one of the reasons why it does so much better. Okay. However, we can't directly compare the relative performance at a particular cycle count due to just how little of the sodium ion cell's nominal capacity is consumed during each cycle. So for example, in the first V3 sodium cycle, the cell only stored 10.1% of the nominal capacity. So if you compare that to the first V1 LFP cycle, which stored 92%, we would need to run quite a few more cycles before we've done the same amount of energy. So to get a true apples to apples energy lifetime comparison, we would need to integrate the total lifetime cell milliamp hour consumption from all prior test data what does this mean? In broad strokes, we need to convert the test results from discrete cycle count to total consumed energy. So I'm not going to go into the actual math, but we can approximate it by squinting our eyes and summarizing the V1 and V3 performance as static values. So after the V3 cell heats up, it can charge 1.75 amp hours per cycle, whereas the V1 cell initially can charge 4.7 amp hours in that first cycle. Therefore, we would need to divide the V3 sodium cell cycle count by 2.7 to compare the cell aging as a function of amp hours between the two cells. So, for example, it is more accurate to compare the V3 sodium's cycle 270 to the V1 LFP's cycle 100. That's a more accurate comparison as far as lifetime energy consumption than it would be to compare the same cycle number between both cells. So like if you were to compare cycle 270 between both cells, that's a less apples to apples comparison. Again, because you're only really shallowly cycling the sodium cell like by 10 or 15 or 18%, whereas that LFP one, you're cycling it, 92% or whatever. In order to have an apples to apples, let's see. Oh, here, yeah, sorry, one other thing. Note that I've never used this alternate method before, the one that I've just proposed here, as every other cell I've ever tested performed close to its nominal ampacity rating. Hence, the error that we just talked about was much less pronounced, maybe up to about 5 or 10%, whereas in this case, it's like a 9 times error. Because it's only 10% versus 92% or whatever. So what does this mean? In order to have an apples to apples long-term comparison between the V3 and V1 cells, I would need to gather approximately quantity 5,400 test cycles with the V3 cell. Gathering that much data is going to take about 10 days, and I'm not going to wait that long prior to filming this video. I propose this is valid because the cell already failed my test criteria after just a few dozen cycles due to overheating. If you disagree, you'll need to wait for a follow-up video in a couple of weeks. Overall, cycling the cell between minimum and maximum allowed voltage range in the Prius, NexPower's prototype V3 cells store very little energy when charged and discharged at high loads. So let's talk about the cells themselves. In post number 9 in my now locked discussion NexPower V3 sodium ion battery announcement thread, I stated the following. Here are some observations after sorting through 32140 sodium ion cell datasheets for an hour. First, every cell I looked at in this form factor is nominally 10 amp hours. So we do have a 10 amp hour cell here, so that math checks out. Again, when I wrote this, I had not even gotten my hands on this prototype yet. So most cells have a recommended maximum discharge rate of 3C, which is 30 amps of assist maximum recommended. And again, I hadn't seen these cells yet, so I found quantity 2 cells that have an absolute maximum peak 15C discharge rate for just a few seconds, so that would be 150 amps assist max. Okay, note that you typically don't want to design a product that hits these absolute maximum ratings. Specs like this are basically saying this will break immediately if you ever do it. Most cells I looked at have a recommended 2C charge rate, which would be 20 amps regen max. Again, the Prius can do like 100 amps or more. I found quantity 1 cell that has a recommended 3C charge rate, i.e. 30 amps regen max recommended. Keep that in mind, the 1 cell I found that has this recommended 3C charge rate. So now that I have the cells in hands, I can in fact confirm that they are only rated to handle a maximum of 30 amps assist and 30 amps regen. They are 3C cells. And they're 10 amp hours, so 10 amp hours times 3 is 30 amps of regen or assist, whereas the Gen 3 Prius can briefly assist at up to 140 amps, but typically maxes out around 100 amps assist. These are approximate values because, again, I'm not a Prius expert, so these are kind of values I've lifted, and community members have helped as well, helped me figure these out. So yeah, we can briefly assist at up to 140 amps, maybe 135 amps, but typically it maxes out around 100 amps. We can briefly regen to at least 100 amps, but typically we max out around 90 amps of regen. So when used in the Prius, NexPower's V3 cells exceed their nominal 30 amp max rating by at least 3x. That would be the 90 here divided by 30 amps, so 3x. Yep, it's probably closer to 4x though, especially in the 140 amps, 120 amps. So for this reason, I have strong concerns that NexPower's 70S 1P V3 design exceeds the 32140 cylindrical cell's maximum specified safe current handling specifications. How do I know this is true? An anonymous viewer did some internet sleuthing and found the exact 32140 cell NexPower is using in their prototype V3 unit that I have. And those are offered for sale on Alibaba. It's actually the same as the one I found here. The labeling looks nearly identical. So here is, let's see. Yeah, here we go. I've done on the labeling here, this is from the Alibaba link here. The text is nearly identical, so the first line is exactly identical. It's 32140NS-30.0 watt hours -3.0 volts. That is identical. The second, and I've highlighted that in orange, everything in orange here is identical. The second line is 047CZAC2A, and that matched my stuff as well. I believe these next few numbers are like a lot number, and then the ones after that I believe are the serial number. That is pure conjecture. I didn't find this in a data sheet. To be honest, there's not a lot of data you can find, but that's kind of typical. You'd have all of these numbers, each one of them means something, and then over here is like a lot or manufacturing date, you know, for example 2024 May 15 or whatever, and then you'd have a serial number there. And this kind of agrees with the 70 cells that I looked at, their values. All of these green values were always the same, so that again specifies like a model specification or whatever. If you know you have a tab that goes X or Y or the, you know, whatever it is. So yes. The text nearly identical. So note that this particular cell has the highest C rate of any of the 32140 cells I found online. Again, that's this one here. I said I found one cell that allowed this 3C and posted about it previously. Yep. So therefore, even though I'm almost certain that the production V3 NexPower packs do use a different cell, in a lot of the videos I'm seeing blue cells. Again, just because I've looked at the 32140 market, I doubt that their production cell has a high enough C rating to handle the Prius's peak current demands. And it's not even close, really. Again, the highest C rating I found for 32140 is 3C. And with the one that had the 15C discharge peak, certainly not the 15C charge peak, just the discharge side. So yeah, the V3 70S1P 32140 pack would need to handle at least 12C peak and probably around 10C for up to around a minute. So given that the best 32140 sodium cells I found can handle up to 30 amps assist in regen, so that would be the 3C value, let's see how much energy we can stuff into a cell at this much lower current value. So whereas the previous data that I've discussed was using my test gauntlet, which is brutal, the cells aren't expected to survive the test. It is designed to test to failure or 3 months or whatever. So let's drop down to that 30 amp value. So in this test, I tested and initially it was a 32 degrees C starting temperature. The cell was still a little bit warm. And again, the hotter it is, the better it performs. So again, that's going to err in NexPower's favor. So yeah, at cycle 1, we had 2.1 amp hours, so we increased from 1.0 to 2.1 amp hours. That's not quite apples to apples, again, because the cell was 7 to 8 degrees warmer. So 2.1 amp hours is about 21% of the nominal value. Again, when I say the nominal value, I mean of the actual full cell here, but we can only use about 36% of that. And so the 21% would be a small portion of this. So say like from here to there. It's not quite the same comparison because we are still charging and discharging to the same voltages. It's just that this usable region gets much more compressed because the slope of this increases quite a bit when you charge and discharge it faster. So on the second cycle, we hopped up to 2.3 amp hours. We'd warmed up a little bit. The third cycle is 2.4. The fourth cycle is 2.4. We stayed around 2.4 cycles, and the cell heated up to, I think it was like 40 degrees Celsius. I didn't run this test for very long. I only ran this for about 10 cycles, so I don't really have any long-term data. But I did want to point out that the effective pack watt hours at 30 amp hours in this first test was 478 watt hours. And if you remember back to my discussion thread for when NexPower first announced this, before I'd ever seen it, my guess was that it was going to be 460 watt hours usable, and we got 478. So I'd say for someone that Jack claims knows very little about sodium cells, I think I did pretty good there because I was off by 18 over 478%. It's a very small number. So yeah, I would say we did not do very well even at the 30 amp test case because we only achieved up to 24% of the nominal cell capacity, which is again very low. So yeah, then I said for fun, let's test regen at 100 amps. So the result from that is that I predict a pack that's initially at 210 volts resting will rise to 250 volts after 30 seconds of heavy regen. That would be regen at 100 amps. Now, my understanding is that the car is going to severely start dialing back regen, maybe around 240 volts. So you are not probably going to be able, once you hit the point where we start dialing back the regen, this period is going to get longer. So let's say it takes 22 seconds to get from 210 to 240 volts. It might take a long time to get to the 250. The reason is that the testing that I'm performing does not have a soak period. So typically you do a CC-CV charge when you're charging lithium batteries, or sodium batteries too. They behave the same. I'm only doing the CC portion of that test because this is an accelerated tester. Once you cross over to the CV range, that's where you're maintaining the voltage and then dropping the current. I don't do that. So as soon as I hit the voltage set point, 3.56 volts, I immediately start the next discharge cycle. And as soon as it's empty, I immediately start charging. And not empty. As soon as I hit the minimum value, say 3 volts or 2.95 or whatever the minimum voltage is, I've probably stated it here. So again, in the car, you're going to get slightly different values, but again, in the real world, I think that you're going to have a very small regen window where you can do the peak regen. Maybe that whenever the peak regen stops might be 22, 23 seconds at 100 amps, if the car even supports that. I'm not sure that it does. It might dial it back after a few seconds. Again, Priuses are not my area of expertise, but the technology behind them is. So yeah, mostly I think this is due to the cell's poor ability to intercalate the sodium ions, and I think that the proof in that is that at higher temperatures the cells can store a lot more energy. Now again, if I stayed in that CV region when the current was allowed to drop, we would probably be able to put quite a bit more power, energy into these cells, but again, the cars had to dial back regen at that point to do that. So ultimately that's going to be a function of how the OEM battery management system handles the cells as they approach empty or full. So it is worth noting that NexPower states their V3 GT pack has less capacity, even less capacity than this non-GT V3 pack that I just tested. My understanding is that the V3 GT cells nominally store only 70% as much energy. I won't know it until I test it. Again, I can only test what I have in front of me, but I do predict that the V3 GT pack will perform equally as poorly in my testing. In particular, given that the V3 GT cells reuse the existing V1 mechanical enclosures, which have even worse cooling than the V3 pack that I just reviewed, I have major concerns that the V3 GT cells will either overheat, or if the Prius's battery management system kicks in, will have a severely limited charge and discharge range before they overheat. Of course, I won't know this for certain until I test it, so this is pure conjecture there. Overall, sodium cells make very little sense in a vehicle originally equipped for nickel metal hydride cells. This is particularly true if you reuse the OEM nickel metal hydride cell monitor computer, because you're stuck with the OEM voltage limits, which are based on a flat nickel metal hydride cell versus sodium's very large voltage swing across state of charge. This hamstrings 2/3 of the usable energy right out of the gate, so all of this area under the curve here that's white, that's not shaded here, you can't use that in the Prius. Most of the remaining usable energy here in this darker shaded area is then lost due to the cell's poor current handling capabilities, which will cause the Prius's computer to severely limit assist and regen current much sooner than would otherwise be possible, e.g. with a lithium iron phosphate or the OEM nickel metal hydride. In this regard, switching back to an LFP cell with a proper BMS that has supervisory control on a per cell basis makes much more sense than the sodium V3 product that I just reviewed. If I were NexPower, I would focus on a design similar to V1 with LFP cells using a proper BMS. For everyone that's about to walk away thinking, but you didn't test this in the car, or nobody's ever going to push the cell that hard,
I do offer the following real-world test, a second one, that anyone with a green-celled prototype V3 pack can use to perform in their car to validate my testing. So the first step is you configure Jack's Dr. Prius app to monitor pack voltage. Second, you drive the car until the car stops charging the pack. I believe, again, this is around 250 volts. And then you find a long uphill stretch of road where you can accelerate for a long time. Two hypotheticals I had here were like I-70 westbound from Denver or driving up Mount Lemmon in Arizona. Then you start a timer while simultaneously accelerating as hard as you can. You literally push the pedal to the floor and just leave it there. Obviously don't speed, so that's why I'm proposing you have a steep hill. And then you keep accelerating until the Prius stops providing assist. Again, I believe this is around 210 volts. So blindly following my test results without thinking about what the Prius is doing predicts that the pack will go from full to empty in 70 seconds. However, my tester does not reduce assist power as the pack approaches empty. Therefore, I predict you'll see the pack voltage drop rapidly from 210 volts down to whatever voltage it is that the OEM computer thinks the pack is empty at, so I don't know, 220 volts. And since the discharge current will decrease when this happens, I am almost certain it will take longer to get all the way to the actual pack empty 210 volts. Again, this is just because the remaining nickel metal hydride computer is going to greatly dial back the assist as the pack approaches empty. So then it might make more sense to look at the region from full, so the 250 volts, to wherever that assist does start getting limited. And my understanding is that the Dr. Prius app does allow you to like, I guess, log, I've never used it, to log a lot of these values on a graph. I've seen the last Jomo, I probably butchered that. I've seen data he posts, so basically data like that. Now, I don't believe he has a V3 pack, so he can't test it, but maybe if needed, he can comment on how he's gathering that data. Fortunately, as long as you record the data and post it online, I can retroactively produce an estimate based on the data that you gather. So using the data that I have, I can look at your performance, basically where your Prius's computers are starting to dial back current, and I can tell you what my expectation would have been. I have all the data, so people think that might be cheating because I can look at the answer while I do my work, but I already have all of the work. I just need to evaluate based on what you have. And I can post this on GitHub before that happens, and that way people can't claim that I massaged the data or whatever. Someone could grab a snapshot of that now and then hold me to it later, obviously, or whatever. So to those V3 beta testers out there who doubt my methodology, please feel free to perform the above test and we can look at the results. And as I've mentioned several times, I don't own a Prius, so if there is skepticism in the community, my understanding is there's 100 total prototype packs. And again, I have a very old one that was manufactured in 2024 May. So I guess those that have newer ones, I don't know if people have blue ones. The people with blue ones, again, I think that my test data will be very similar to yours because just looking at the availability of these cells, I don't see them being able to perform better than this no matter where they're made. Now, Jack has made claims that I can neither validate nor invalidate that the CATL cells that the production version uses are of his design or of someone's design to where they're better than anyone else's, and for some reason CATL is not going to be selling those to anyone else but him. I'm not really sure what exactly that's about. But again, I wanted to look at the Alibaba thing, so we looked at these two pictures already. This was the actual link here. I did the rough math, and when you buy 100,000 pieces, they're $2.50 a piece. And so at quantity 70, this would be $178 in cells for the pack. Of course, you have assembly and all the development. I'm not saying that Jack charging, I think the $1,700 or whatever, $1,750, that's a 10x markup, which is honestly for a product like this, sure, there's a lot of work and effort that's gone into it. I still believe there's a lot of work that should go into this before it's released, as I've discussed in my previous videos. Oh, and then finally, here's the data sheet-ish thing. This is the most information that I could find on this particular battery. The charging and discharging temperature, -20 and -4, and then the charge and discharge rates of 3C. And then it's more safer. It's a really important thing to know. So anyway, that is my long-term cell tester, and then kind of derivative testing, you know, the 30 amp charge and discharge, and then the 100 amp charge and discharge. Overall, I'm not terribly impressed with this sodium battery. I did want to note, I thought I had written it in here, but maybe I haven't. Again, I did mention this. Yeah, the 400 cycle count. So this cell did, you know, again, we needed to divide this by something like 2.7 or whatever. And I don't do math in my head often, so 400 divided by 2.7. So this is roughly equivalent to like 150 cycles on the previous V1 LFP. So I don't have enough data is basically what I'm saying to know whether or not these are performing better or worse. I will say that I was quite impressed that even though the cells had technically failed by cycle 34 or whatever the number was, I think it was 34. The fact that they didn't continue to overheat once they were at like 74 or 73 degrees C, whatever their max was, it's pretty, I was impressed. But again, in the pack, that the cooling is not going to be as good because even though you have the forced airflow from those fans, if it can get through the very narrow cell spacing, you have all of those neighboring cells, particularly those inner cells that have cells all around them that are generating just as much heat. Those boys going to get hot quick. And so I would think that you would see a lot of heat fade on these packs where if you're hitting a system region, the postal mailman, the mailman that just slams the gas on, slams the brake, slams the gas, slams the brake, I would think they'd get those cells pretty hot pretty quick. And I'm sure you can monitor those cell temperatures in the Dr. Prius app. That could be interesting data to look at as well, anyone who's going to gather that data. So the cell so far, again, I'll have more data later. I think it performed, as far as the capacity fade, I think it performed slightly better than I was expecting, particularly considering how hot it got so quickly. But we'll know more in a week or two after I've been able to gather the 5,700 cycles I needed, or whatever the equivalent cycling was. So as always, thank you for watching.